Hi everyone, MsMalcolmHughes here. Welcome back to our fourth discussion of You Might Want to Know, my article Roundup. And I'm very excited to be here, so let's just get right into it. All right, so jumping right in, our first story that we'll discuss is North Korea has already won. U.S. urged to abandon denuclearization farce. So this article is really about the current state of what's happening with North Korea having different weapons and the long-term impact of it. And people, as you all know, been arguing for a while that North Korea should not be able to have these weapons, but North Korea feels differently. And this is really what we're talking about. There were a couple of key pieces here that I wanted to discuss. So here we are. Insistence on denuclearization is not just a failure, it has turned into a farce, said Ankit Panda, a nuclear weapons expert at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. They test, we respond, we move on with our lives, Panda noted. North Korea has already won. It's a bitter pill, but at some point, we're going to have to swallow it. And so, again, it's about North Korea, the government not wanting North Korea to have nuclear weapons. And the reality is they have them in that they keep testing them in an attempt to show force and honestly to defy, arguably, to defy the parameters that are being placed on them. And here's the point, right? In some stories, there are no good guys, and even a broken clock is right twice a day. And I say that because in the same article, Kim Jong-un, who is the leader of North Korea, does make, honestly, a good point. So I'll lead into it, and then I'll get into his point. So US and Korean officials insisted that even a tacit acceptance of North Korea's status as a nuclear armed state would have dangerous consequences for global non-proliferation efforts. So again, they're just iterating that it's a danger for North Korea to have these weapons. And even though the urge is to accept the fact that they have them, and the conversation should now be around getting to a point where we can have a conversation and them agreeing to not use them, opposed to us stressing that they shouldn't have them. The reality is that they have them and they're not going to get rid of them. Last month, Kim Jong-un amended North Korea's nuclear doctrine to allow for preemptive strikes. The previous policy only permitted the use of nuclear weapons in a second strike scenario. Now, this is where it gets dicey, right? So instead of it being from a response standpoint, you may then be the aggressor. But this is what Kim Jong-un has to say. There will never be any declaration of giving up our nukes or denuclearization, nor any kind of negotiations or bargaining to meet the other side's conditions, the North Korean leader declared. As long as nuclear weapons exist on Earth and imperialism remains, our road towards strengthening nuclear power won't stop. This is what I mean when I say even a broken clock is right twice a day. No matter how the world feels about North Korea, the reality is they are their own independent nation. And if the majority of other countries around the world have nuclear weapons, I am not in support of nuclear weapons. We are not the divine. We are not able to give someone their life back. So I think it gets tricky by saying we can wipe out an entire people with these nuclear weapons. I don't think that's right. But if we live in a world where majority of countries have nuclear weapons, if we live in a world where imperialism exists, right, where other countries, as we can see now, and we'll get to it a little later, the war in Ukraine, other countries are able to go in and invade other countries and use military force to overpower them in order to take control. I don't think Kim Jong-un is wrong to say that, hey, you have them. You're not planning to get rid of them. You would use your power against us if you could. So why would I get rid of mine? Don't disagree. And here is why all of this is important. in terms of international relations. And here's the thing about the articles that I choose to share, not necessarily all the ones that I choose to read. I read tons of articles, but the ones I share, I find interesting because I think it's important for all of us to engage with international affairs. It's always been a passion of mine, but we all live on this earth together, and the decisions that we make impact all of us. So this story is actually from the Financial Times, and you all know I'm a big fan because the reality is follow the money, see where it leads. North Korea has also seized on Russia's international isolation to foster closer ties with Moscow. Hey, Coco! On Wednesday, the Security Council failed to condemn Pyongyang's missile launch after Russia and China blamed Washington for ignoring North Korean security. Most senior U.S. officials working on North Korea policy now privately recognize that denuclearization isn't going to happen, but can't or won't say it publicly, said Chad O'Carroll, founder of the North Korea Group Consultancy. So I think the reality is we need to be aware of what's happening with North Korea because, as you can see, everyone's talking about the war in Ukraine, but North Korea is currently trying to partner with Russia and using this as an opportunity. So this is just one of the articles I've been reading and wanted to share for y'all. So definitely check it out. All right, so this one is in Spanish, but I'm just going to translate the title for you all and tell you why I think it's important. So Nayib Bukele buscará la reelección en 2024 en contra de la Constitución. So basically, the president of El Salvador is currently saying that he's going to seek re-election in 2024, even though it's against the Constitution for him to have another term. And I think this matters because we know Trump was talking about doing the same thing here. Putin is doing this, wanted to do it, will try to do the same thing in Russia. So I think that when we see situations like this happen, just to like hone in, because what's happening in other powerful countries definitely impacts our nation as well. And so this is just something I wanted to share just based on that topic. Because again, international relations, international affairs, I think that it continues to be dangerous with the abuses of power, and we're seeing it more and more. So what does that mean for the future? And what does that mean for our own elections in 2024 when someone like Trump is saying that he wants to run again? So just something to think about. And this article I actually got from, it's a website called News in Slow Spanish. So if you're learning Spanish, it's definitely a good resource. All right, the next one, this, as you all know, has been a topic of conversation for a while. Everything happened with Kanye. But I feel like this article, the writer does a really good job, and it's from Charles Blow for the New York Times. He does a really good job of not just slamming Kanye West or being critical of him, but really rooting it in historical context and a lot of what Kanye has said and why it matters and why his language and the actions that he's taking is actually dangerous for Black people. And just, I'll share a couple of excerpts from the article that I think were really worthwhile and discuss a little bit. And so he starts off by saying, among Kanye West defenders, the thinking goes like this. He is a genius, a free thinker, an elevated conscience. They may not like or agree with everything he does, but they applaud the man. There is a cult of Kanye. And I came to the opinion long ago that our society confers a special allure on cults, particularly when they are tied not to religion, but to pop culture or politics. In those arenas, they feel fun, innocent, like rooting together for a favorite team. So I'm not here to argue about whether West is a genius, although when someone refers to themselves as such, it tends to undercut the appellation. And I think just opening this up, the argument of what we have in our society where there's so many super fan groups of artists and how they rally behind them no matter what happens. And so for Kanye West, there is a cult of Kanye West. I don't know if I would have used that verbiage, but I think that it's interesting to consider the dangers of a cult. We often think of it with religion, but then to think of our superstars having cults, and then where are you leading the people to, right? And so where is Kanye West trying to lead us? That part is uncertain. I also don't care to argue whether or not Kanye West is genius. I think genius is relative, but I do think there is inherent danger, which is why I want to share this article. So I'll share some more. And the lead in here is that he says that a lot of people like to compare Kanye or think of Kanye as like Mozart, who was a tortured genius. But he says here, West is no Mozart. West is a brooding, narcissistic, attention addict and praise junkie. He attends his torture. He curates and employs it. Some of it may come naturally, but some is manufactured to enlarge the legend. I will let others debate whether his talents as an artist, which are remarkable, rise to that of genius. I want to focus instead on West as a cultural chaos agent, as a purveyor of dangerous politics. In this arena, he is no genius. He is a gussied up gimmick. West's latest brushes with thoughtless provocation came this weekend when he was kicked off Twitter and our other social media platforms for a series of anti-Semitic posts. But as noted, these are merely his latest brushes with thoughtless provocation. West is often described as a free thinker, but in the political space, he isn't. He's simply a Black artist willing to regurgitate conservative, sometimes bordering on white supremacist talking points as if they were his own. This honestly was a true read, but I think that it's necessary. So I do think that when he says that Kanye West is a cultural chaos agent, I think that oftentimes Kanye West, it gets tricky when we're in a capitalistic society because Kanye feels like he's selling product, right? And so whatever he has to do to get to that point, he doesn't see the problem. At least that's what he says. But I also think this is the same man, and he talks about this a little bit more later, who, if you listen to his first two albums, was very conscious and very aware of different struggles impacting the Black community. So for him to make a lot of the statements these days, whether it is the White Lives Matter t-shirt, or remember back in the day, what was it, 2013, when he was selling the Confederate flag apparel, right? It's at what point do you sacrifice the liberation of your people in order to make money, right? And the thing with Kanye West, it also gets tricky because he is and has been diagnosed with a mental health condition, right? So at one point, do you consider that? Is he thinking clearly? Is he having a manic episode? Is he in mania, as opposed to are these his actual true feelings and true thoughts? So that's another point to consider as well. But I also like what the writer says when he goes here. He says, West is the same man who in 2013 was selling merchandise with Confederate flags on tour. As he explained to a radio station that year about people's appalled reactions, any energy is good energy. The Confederate flag represented slavery in a way. That's my abstract take on what I know about it, right? So I wrote the song New Slaves. So I took the Confederate flag and made it my flag. It's my flag now. Kanye West recently said that he doesn't read, right? Which I don't. It's obviously he's read a book. He was like, he's never read a book. He's obviously read a book. This man was someone who dropped out of college. You don't get to that point in your life, in your educational career, without having read any books at some point. But with that being said, this argument is a flawed argument, and I wish that he would read because he would be able to understand that for himself, right? Because you cannot take, first of all, here's the question, right? It often comes up when people ask, can Black people be racist, or is it just prejudice? Racism is rooted in power, right? So if you do not have power against another group of people in order to subjugate them and confine them to a certain class based on the power in which you possess, right? And it's arguable that you can't actually be racist because you don't have the power to do anything about it, right? So for Kanye West to say, oh, I'm taking that Confederate flag and I'm going to make it mine now, it's kind of the same argument. You don't actually have the power to do that. You can try to take it and manipulate it, but it doesn't take away the long legacy behind it. It doesn't take away from the fact that when certain individuals see that, it has a specific meaning and messaging behind it. So you attempting to use capitalism in order to flip it into something that's not, or your branding doesn't work. And also, it goes back to Audre Lorde of the master's tools cannot be used to dismantle the master's house, right? So that's the thing that frustrates me about capitalism, or even when we get into these conversations about rich, billionaires and Black people being billionaires and whether or not it's good or bad. I'm never mad at anyone for getting their money. I'm also not mad at people who've been oppressed in a nation surviving and thriving the best ways that they can, right? So I'm not mad at that. But the issue comes back to capitalism won't save us, right? Having an abundance of money planned into the system doesn't save us. It's part of the root problem. So if you're part of, there's always been people who have been included in how money has, to a certain degree, allowed them to be in a certain class and a certain stature, right? So this is just an old game that he's playing. It's not very unique or original, and it's not working. And our writer goes on to continue with that. He says Kanye pitches it as co-option, but it is, in fact, basic shock value antics that promote and normalize anti-Black hate symbols, right? And so that's the point I'm trying to make. He surmises it much more quickly and eloquently, but that is the point. It's not new. It's not original. It is still anti-Black. You don't get to take it and try to flip it to something else. It doesn't take away from the historical context, and you're doing that. So there's nothing genius about it. It is bargain basement exploitation. As West put it himself, any energy is good energy, which is just an almost spiritual, if jargony, way of interpreting what Oscar Wilde wrote in The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a very good book. I recommend you all read it, in the late 1800s. There is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. The spirit of that idea led to all the publicity is good publicity. And that's what we see here with Kanye West, which honestly, it's not true. Like, you're not looking good in the media right now. So if that's your aim, it's not working. And just to wrap this article up, West later, this lead in is when West made the comments on TMZ about slavery being a choice. So West later apologized for the slavery comments, but even in the apology, he could not control his narcissism, saying, in a relationship, maybe somebody will do something just to see if you still love them. One thing that I got from the TMZ comment is it showed me how much Black people love me and how much Black people count on me and depend on me. And I appreciate that. But then the question becomes, do you value it? Do you understand the inherent weight that comes with that, right? For people to admire you and love you and hold you to a certain esteem, there are expectations, right? Heavy is the head that wears a crown. So if you know that the people who are rooting for you and standing behind you are Black people, then you cannot turn around and take a slogan that has been used for the liberation of Black people to say, I'm going to use this for the group that's oppressing them, to attempt to send a message, but also to, I think, higher up on your list is to profit from it. That's a problem, right? That's absolutely a problem. And so in closing, none of this in the political sphere is genius. It's shallow and dull. Kanye is just a Black man who discovered Black conservatism and thinks it's enlightenment. There is nothing complex or mysterious about it. He's a Black man parodying white supremacy, while far too many brush it off, continue dancing to his music, and wear his clothes. West is a Black man sampling vintage anti-Black racism, remixing and releasing it under a new label, the Tortured Black Genius. So again, it was a read for Kanye, but I think it was necessary. And I love the fact that the article is rooted in Kanye's actions and then the actual impact that it has on the culture. So obviously you can tell I want you to check it out. Our next article, this one will be quicker, but it's the U.S. ties itself closer to Kyiv as top officials see echoes of Cuba. And this was in Politico. And I really appreciated this one because as we continue to engage with Ukraine and Russia in the ongoing war, it's important to think about the political positions that are being made and the strategies that are occurring. And so for me, this one here is really thinking about what's the stance that the U.S. has, what role are we playing, what's the future? And as the war continues to rage on and Putin makes certain stances, will our role simply be to continue to provide weapons and support, or at some point will we have to take a more active stance, essentially leading to World War III? And so we'll get into some points that are being made about that here. And so just one of the first excerpts. So at the United Nations this week, American diplomats are lobbying countries to support a resolution rebuking Russia for its claim to have annexed 4 Ukrainian territories. A vote is expected Wednesday. So that did happen. Putin claimed that they had annexed certain territories and the Ukraine actually took those back, and it wasn't the case. So also, that's just a totally different conversation, but how much are you putting, like the reality of what's happening on the ground, the reality of what's being spewed in Russia are sometimes arguably very different, and the dangers in that. So US lawmakers, meanwhile, are invoking Ukraine as they move to push Saudi Arabia for an OPEC oil production that could help Russia and deepen an energy crisis that is already testing the resolve of the Western alliance. There's also bipartisan agreement on Capitol Hill in favor of boosting Ukraine's ability to defend itself from missile strikes and drone attacks as anger flares toward Russian leader Vladimir Putin over his threats of nuclear retaliation. So again, with the nuclear weapons, right? Like I said, none of this is not connected. So when we talk about nuclear weapons in Korea, then we're in North Korea specifically, we're also talking about what's happening in Russia, right? And then how does that impact what's happening in the war in Ukraine? And then how does that impact Saudi Arabia and oil prices in America? It's all connected. That's what that's what I try to demonstrate. So that's why I'm so intrigued by international affairs. But here, so Russia and Saudi Arabia are in collaboration. The US doesn't want that, and Putin doesn't care. And what does this all mean for us moving forward? Let's see. So for years, many in Washington have overlooked concerns, and this is where we get into what's happening in Saudi Arabia and why it matters. For years, many in Washington have overlooked concerns about anti-democratic actions and human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia in the name of advancing mutual security interests in the region, especially on countering the Islamist regime in Iran. Yet Biden's administration officials see a potential shift on the horizon after the kingdom effectively sided with Russia. So there's an article that I'll share like next time that I am currently in the process of reading that really talks about the impact of Saudi Arabia and Russia being in collaboration and the potential threat against America and what that could all mean. And so it's so funny to me how they're saying so many things have happened, right? So many atrocities are happening in Saudi Arabia, but like everyone's hands off because you're in cahoots. I am not ever one for America going colonizing and pushing democracy on other nations, but it's also problematic to sit back and see an atrocity being done and to not say anything about it because you're profiting, right? So I think that's an inherent danger. So now you want to bring all these up because they're in cahoots with your enemy, right? And how the old saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's how this is playing out here. And I just think playing politics, because we often think of it as politics, but it's actually people, right? And you're playing with the lives and livelihoods of others. And I just think that's dangerous. But to continue on with this, despite the latest U.S. efforts to boost the Ukrainians, Biden teams insist that the United States still has no intention of putting American troops on the battlefield and directly facing off with a fellow nuclear power. We do not seek conflict with Russia. The president has been crystal clear about that, Kirby said, adding, no one wants to see the war escalate into the nuclear realm. So in closing, two things, even though we're still allies with Ukraine, there's no intent of sending extra troops, and everyone's trying to keep this out of the nuclear realm because Putin has implied that they do have nuclear weapons and not afraid to use them. Let us hope and pray that continues to be the case, and also that this war ends soon. All right, so last but certainly not least is this article that I found and still find really interesting, and that's Love and Theft in Latin Music. And this is actually on Tidal. So I don't know if you all know, but Tidal actually has like an article section where it goes and they review different concepts or issues in music. And I find some really interesting articles there. So if you're a music head, definitely just head over to Tidal.com, or if you have the app, just on the app, you scroll down, you'll see the article section. But as you all know, I've been studying Spanish forever. So in learning the language, you always learn a culture. And so this is something we see not just in Latin music, you see this in Black music as well. And you'll see what I mean as I continue to talk about this. But in short, it's about different highly successful white presenting Latinos taking musical trends from less currently less successful poor Latino nations making it broad stream, and then the people who are Black presenting of a lower social status are not seeing the profits from that and are not necessarily blowing up from that. So what I like about this article is that it discusses that, it talks about the issues, and it also provides potential solutions. And another point, and I'll get to it when I share this excerpt from it, is one thing I really, really find so intriguing about Latino culture is it rides under this banner of we're Latino, we're Latino, we're Latinos, like, but in that you hide a lot of issues as far as like race and how it all pans out. And even when I was living in Puerto Rico, like a lot of the discussion is it's class, it's not race. And it's like class and race are so, same thing in the US, so intricately linked that you can't really divide the two because it all does come back to like power and control. That's a topic that I want to get into so much more depth. When I do go for my PhD, it'll be part of my dissertation and what I intend to study. But yeah, this is a topic that I find so interesting. But anyway, back to this. This is basically about appropriation in Latin music. So let's get into it. So inside the hugely diverse world of Latin music, artists and communities trade sounds and traditions, often to mega selling success. But at what point does creative cross-pollination become exploitation and appropriation? So that's what the article delves into. Here's a good excerpt. The Latin music industry, itself a product of Western interest in marketing, has long banked on the assumption that we're all Latinx, so we're all equal, to avoid confronting and changing the structures that uphold racial privilege, in which, while Latinx and Hispanic artists are afforded advantages because of their skin color, mestizos or mixed Latin race artists occupy a gray area where their status is determined by their proximity to whiteness, their level of education, their access to wealth, their citizenship status, and so on. But as Dr. Talaj and Moda point out, for Latinx artists who are unambiguously Black or Indigenous, and oftentimes from low-income backgrounds, true equality remains to be seen, especially when an artist from outside of their community is the one reaping the benefits of a genre sourced from within. And so, like I said, we see this across different cultures, but I do think it's inherently dangerous. And as the main picture showed, Rosalia, who is here, she is Spanish. You also have, I don't want to mess her name up. It's like she's a Dominican, like reggaeton artist, like trap reggaeton. Yeah, I don't. It's like Takashi or something like that. But they've done songs together. But like Rosalia is a more white presenting Spanish artist who has worked with a lot of other artists, but it's like it's argued that she takes from different cultures and they don't really benefit from it. And she's just one example. We'll get into some other folks as well. And it's even been pushed back from her being at the Latin Grammys, right? Because she is Spanish and there is this inherent, I don't want to say like beef, but it's basically like Spain colonized all of these nations, right? All of these countries speak Spanish because Spain colonized them. I think people fail to remember that, right? Like all of these countries had indigenous people there who spoke their own languages. So even though they're bonded under, then listen, y'all about to give me on my soapbox topic, but because there's so many Latinos who take pride and put down other like Latinos if they don't speak Spanish. It's like it's some people, not all of them, but it's like a huge thing. And so it's like you're taking great pride in a language that was forced upon your ancestors. Think about it. But so that's a big part of the beef too, is because Rosalia is from Spain. So she does come in and she works, she's also white presenting. She works with all of these other poor Latino artists. She takes their sound, she incorporates it into her own, but then do they really profit and benefit from it? So again, we see that in hip hop, we see that in Black culture, that's been happening forever. But I, again, like this article because it kind of breaks it down. So here's how the writer summarizes it here. Beyond artists, Latin music industry professionals can also make deeper commitments to support Black and Indigenous acts, especially as their genres continue to grow. It is true, commercially speaking, that executives and other personnel must toe a tricky line. Their decisions need to appeal to the sensibilities of mainstream English-speaking audiences, while also managing to engage the distinct yet interesting groups of Latin American nationals, Spanish speakers, and the diaspora, each with its own specific biases surrounding race and culture. But as tastemakers, these individuals have a responsibility to promote a palette of inclusivity rather than uphold the same hierarchies that have disenfranchised their people. So I love that because it was a solution to the problem, right? You cannot change what's been ongoing at the moment, but there are systems you can put in place. There are action steps that you can take. You can make sure that the people whose culture you are actually using to promote your music, that those people are celebrated, right? You can ensure that they're getting paid. So there are steps that you can take, and that's what I really appreciated about this article. It talked about the problem, but it also provided a possible solution. So that's it. Those are my articles. Hopefully some food for thought for y'all. Those are ones that I found interesting during my reading throughout the week. But definitely let me know your thoughts below. Did you find any of these interesting? What are your opinions on some of these topics? And I will catch y'all next time. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, y'all.